Hi there, welcome to this webinar, The 7 Core Pillars of a High Performance Brain, how to optimize your brain's health, fitness, and longevity every day with proven high impact habits. Now this is actually a pre-recorded version of the webinar which took place on Thursday, April 3rd, but you're getting all the same content except for me interacting live with the audience. So it's a little more condensed than Thursday versions, but all the same information. So without further ado, let's get started. First, a little bit about me. My name is Daniel Morrow, and I've been in the academic world for quite some time. I started out with a diploma in electronic engineering technology. Then I moved on to do a BA in math at University of Ottawa. While I was there, I took an introductory course in psychology. It really fascinated me, so I started studying psychology at Carleton University and completed a combined BA in music and psychology. Then I went on to do an honors in psychology, and finally I completed my master's degree in cognitive science. Now, long before I was studying psychology and cognitive science at the academic level, I had a deep passion for understanding human nature. I really wanted to understand what made people tick. And so for about the past 20 years or so, I've been studying and researching related fields of psychology, neuroscience, linguistics, cognitive science, philosophy of mind, brain training technology, and brain optimization systems. And the last 6 or 7 or 8 years, I've developed and taught a number of events related to the brain. One of them, Exploring the Musical Brain. I taught a 25-hour, 5-day intensive to enriched high school students, showing how the brain processes music and how music can be healing. And then I taught a course called Accelerated Learning 101, tapping into the power of neuroplasticity. This was for high school students as well as university students to teach them how to optimize their learning rituals and learn more information in less time. And then I developed another course called Heart Intelligence for the 21st Century, which was all about this new finding that there's actually the equivalent of a tiny brain within our heart. So fascinating stuff. As of last summer of 2013, I published my first ebook called Build Yourself a Better Brain 12 Brain Healthy Habits to Unleash Your Mind's Potential. And that got me on a path to further explore all the latest science on brain optimization and enhancement. And just recently, as of January of 2014, I published my first digital magazine, which is called High Performance Brain Magazine, which you can find on Apple Newsstand. So let's begin with the actual content today. First, before we talk about the 7 core pillars of a high performance brain, I want to talk about the basic mechanisms of neuroplasticity. What exactly is neuroplasticity? Well, there's been a lot of excitement in neuroscience and related fields because some of the old myths about the brain have been broken. The idea that the neurons that we're born with is what we continue with throughout life, and that myth was broken a couple decades ago with the animal research, and recently it's been verified in humans that in fact there's something called neurogenesis. This is a process in which new neurons are sprouted in the brain. So this is good news for us because while there are neurons in the brain dying every day, there's also new neurons which are sprouting in very specific areas of the brain. Then there's the biochemistry that can change. So for instance, there's something called neurotransmitters in the brain. These are chemicals which underlie the signaling properties of the brain. Two popular ones are GABA and glutamate, but then there's what's called the regulatory neurotransmitters such as serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, which governs our mood states, our emotions, our motivation, and so forth. So we can definitely change the biochemistry of the brain by sort of involving ourselves in certain behaviors and actions. And then there's the neural structure. So the neurons in the brain are the basic building blocks of the brain, and they consist of basic inputs called dendrites and the soma, or body of the cell, and the output of the cell, which is the axon, and then the myelin sheath, which is the fatty tissue surrounding the axon. So we can definitely influence the structure of our neurons by how we nourish our brains. Then there are the so-called brainwave frequencies, which I think most people have heard about. And the brain operates dynamically in certain frequency states, and we can shift those brainwave states. When we're awake and alert, we tend to be in beta. When we're in a more relaxed but alert state, that's alpha, kind of a dreamy state, and theta is a very deep meditative state. And then you've got delta state. So delta and theta are associated with the sleeping state. So there's definitely a number of things we can do to deliberately shift our brainwave frequencies, which then indirectly influences the other mechanisms of neuroplasticity. So synaptogenesis, that's kind of similar to neurogenesis, except it's creating new synaptic growth in the brain. And the synapses are the connecting interfaces between neurons. It's how neurons communicate with one another. It's actually, the synapse is actually a gap between neurons that gets filled up with the chemicals, the neurotransmitters, and which is the mediating process that helps neurons to communicate, and then that gets turned into electrical signals. So synaptogenesis, very important mechanism of neuroplasticity. Then there's the general connectivity of the brain, what we call the neural networks. And some of the behaviors that we undertake on a day-to-day basis that involve new learning or novel experience will definitely have an impact in rewiring some of the neural networks of the brain into new patterns. In fact, the brain is constantly being rewired. It's just that if we undertake specific experiences and new novel learning experiences, that creates a more deliberate impact on the brain. And then there's the gray matter density of certain structures in the brain. In fact, we can actually change cortical structures such as the hippocampus. There's a well-known study about London cab drivers. It turns out the hippocampi of London cab drivers is larger than those of the normal population simply because they have this enormous database of the streets and layout of London. They have to memorize basically the whole city. So that memory work involves the hippocampus, and therefore it changes the hippocampus. So that's just some of the basic mechanisms of neuroplasticity and the ways in which we can change our brain. The brain is neuroplastic, meaning it is flexible, it is malleable, it is changeable. Now, there's something called a neuroscience revolution that is taking place according to some prominent neuroscientists. And this is an exciting time for us because the information that's coming out is very empowering to you and me, because it means we can take deliberate actions to positively influence our brain. And here's the first key point, which sometimes I think people take for granted, and that is that your brain affects virtually everything about you. It affects how you think, your emotional states, your speech, the decisions you make every day, your social interactions with others, how physically coordinated you are, how successful you are in life, and so many more things. And here's the good news, though. You are in charge of your own brain's development. You can make a deliberate impact on the functioning structures and processes in your brain by carrying out systematic daily actions every day. And we actually know what those actions are. I call them habits. Now, this neuroplasticity revolution is exciting because there's some amazing cutting edge advancements in brain science that really is showing us and explaining to us how exactly the brain learns and grows and adapts and rewires itself. So the information is now available to the masses, and we can take advantage of that information to as it were, design a better functioning brain. And so that's what this presentation about. It is a model that I've developed about brain enhancement called the 7 core pillars of a high performance brain. And this is really a framework that's consolidating the best and latest neuroscience research into a user friendly system of brain healthy habits and practices. As we review the 7 pillars of a high performance brain, we're also going to give examples of some of the high impact habits that are associated with each of those pillars. Things that we can do in everyday life that don't cost us anything and that are very simple to carry out. So before getting into the 7 pillars, I just want to talk about the importance of what I call brain healthy habits. So we all have good habits and bad habits. Um, we can meditate regularly or take a walk every day or do exercise. And then there's other not so good habits such as smoking and binging on junk foods or staying up late, not getting sufficient sleep. And the thing is, bad habits are notoriously hard to break, and at the same time, good habits are hard to establish. And brain healthy habits in particular are simple but not easy. So the kind of habits I'm referring to, the very simple things that you can do, such as yogic breathing, exposure to sunlight, taking in superfoods every day. So very simple habits, but not necessarily easy to implement because it means you have to overcome certain patterns that are in place. You have to take deliberate um, action and engage your will. And people think that habits can take anywhere from 21 to 40 days to establish. 40 days is the popular number in yogic traditions and mantra practice. And some people suggest that 30 days is sufficient to create a new habit. Eben Pagan is one of those people. He discusses something known as habit gravity, which is like a force that we must overcome within ourselves to establish a new habit. And it's very difficult in that first 10 or 20 days. We're excited for the first 2 or 3 days, and then it's very easy for those habits to fall away, just as what happens with our so-called New Year's resolutions, right? You're really excited to make changes in your life, and then how quickly we forget that just days or weeks later. So habit gravity, according to Eben Pagan, is a powerful force that we have to overcome to establish just a single new habit. And in this presentation, I'm going to be discussing, a dozen or so habits, brain healthy habits that we can hopefully engage and integrate into our life to design that ideal brain that we know is possible from the research that's out there. So the whole idea here is that we can learn to integrate so-called right habits, and the right habits are those that impact your brain's health and structure, its wiring, connectivity, and organization, and that will essentially systematically optimize your brain function in the short term and all across your lifespan. So without further ado, let us get into the framework itself, the 7 core pillars of optimal brain performance. So I've sort of organized this framework into 7 pillars because I think it just helps us to understand the relationship between certain brain healthy habits and which aspects of the brain are being impacted and how exactly we're optimizing our brain in these different areas. So first of all, we've got the first pillar is relax your limbic brain. I start out with this one because I think it's a really important starting place. Stress is very damaging to the brain, as we know. It can really reduce our neural resources, and stress causes all sorts of other problems that impact our learning and can lead to strokes or certain mental disorders. So relax your limbic system is the first core pillar of optimal brain performance. Then we've got focus, and focus has to do with your frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are considered the seat of consciousness. They're the largest area of the brain, taking up about 1/3 of the brain. They're the last to develop in humans and the first to atrophy, and they're also larger in humans than in any species on the planet. So focusing your frontal lobes is a very important pillar because it's like a muscle that needs to be worked. We'll call it the focus muscle. And developing your focus muscle is very important um, for really being much more mentally productive in life and getting more done in less time. Another important pillar, nourish. Nourish your neurochemistry and your neurons. So as we talked about, neurons have basic components to them, dendrites and axons and so forth. And then there's the neurochemistry of the neurotransmitters in the brain. And there's certain things that we can do, very simple habits like the right nutrition and quality sleep and exercise that will help to nourish those neurons in the brain and make them actually more efficient. We can actually increase the efficiency of our neurons and neural networks in the brain. So very important pillar. Then there's what I call rewire, or rewire your neural networks. And this is typically what we associate with the concept of neuroplasticity and the idea that the brain is flexible and changing and always being rewired. But again, we have a very high degree of influence on how we rewire our brain every day by what we do, what we say, what we think. Essentially, the actions we take, those so-called brain healthy habits, are key here. The fifth pillar is synchronize your rhythmic systems. This is not as common in the neuroscience literature, but I consider it to be very important. This has to do with various levels of rhythmic activity in the brain and body. We talked about the so-called rhythmic brain states or brainwave frequencies. We've also got rhythms in the heart. We can create a coherent signal in the heart because it's actually quite intelligent and interfaces with the brain and rest of the body. And then there's the circadian rhythms, which is the daily bodily rhythms. So there are many things we can do to synchronize the hemispheres of our brain and the rest of the systems in the body as well. Then we've got number 6, accelerate. This has to do with how you process information, how you learn, how effective your memory is. Accelerate also has to do with your mental productivity and the ability to sort of deal with this phenomena known as information overwhelm. So again, this could be a whole course in itself, but I'm including it here as an important pillar of optimizing your brain. Then finally, we've got reprogram, perhaps the most important pillar in this framework, because essentially this has to do with how you utilize your brain. Okay? It's like we have this incredible system in our body called the brain that is probably the most complex and sophisticated self-contained system in the universe, containing some 100 billion neurons and complex networks of connectivity. So we have established that there are things we can do to influence and optimize the brain, but how do we use our brain? And this has to do with reprogramming your mental and emotional patterns and creating kind of like a new personality, establishing this ideal persona or identity that allows you to be more successful in life. So reprogram your mental emotional patterns is the 7th core pillar of a high performance brain. So let's delve in to a little bit more specifics about each of these 7 core pillars and give some examples of what I would consider brain healthy habits for each of the pillars. First, relax your limbic brain. That was the first pillar. The limbic system has to do with emotions, learning, memory, social bonding. And there are some key structures in the limbic system that have to do with the stress response, the fight or flight response. And when we get stressed out, when we face a stressful situation, whether it's real or imagined, then structures like the hypothalamus and pituitary get activated. The hypothalamus is like a command center of homeostasis and involved in the stress response. It will send signals to the pituitary, which then sends signals to the adrenals to produce adrenaline and cortisol in the system. And acute stress is okay, but chronic stress, very, very bad for the brain and the body because it actually kills neurons in the brain, specifically the hippocampus. And as we know from research, people who have Alzheimer's disease actually have less neurons in their hippocampus, a smaller hippocampus. So very, very important to balance and reduce stress levels in your life because it's damaging to the brain. So the stress response and the relaxation response is mediated through the autonomic nervous system, and there are two branches called the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system has to do with sympathy, so it's the stress response. It's the system that gets engaged when we are faced with a stressful situation and all the blood is shunted away to our limbs, and at that point digestion is not a priority. Then there's the parasympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system is the other side. It's the relaxation response. So we want to balance the autonomic nervous system, and there's many ways that we can do that. And then there's the regulatory neurotransmitters such as serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and again, they mediate and govern our mood states. A couple habit practices that we can engage in to really deal with this concept of stress in modern day life. There's far too much stress, which means everybody's sympathetic nervous system is way too engaged, is imbalanced. So yogic breath, very powerful habit that we can use every day. And one particular form of pranayama is called alternate nostril, and that is a technique for balancing left and right hemisphere function, for calming the brain, for creating a state of calmness within, and very powerful to do when you're stressed out or before something like you have to give a presentation and you want to calm down. So it's something that we can use each and every day, several times a day if you wish. Then progressive relaxation, popularized by Herbert Benson, and that's really sort of like a tension relaxation exercise where you systematically go through all the parts of the body and tense them up and then completely relax them. And if you do that for several minutes, alternate tensing and relaxing of all the body parts, you'll feel that you're very, very relaxed afterwards. Your body is relaxed, you're shifting brainwave states, and you're feeling calm. So two habit practices are yogic breath and progressive relaxation. Now, focus your frontal lobes was the second pillar of a high performance brain. The frontal lobes, as I mentioned, are very important in some of the higher functions, such as planning and sequencing, organizing information, thinking about the future, and also motor coordination. The prefrontal cortex in particular is considered the executive center of the brain, and it's in charge of sort of organizing other brain centers. So we really want to work that focus muscle so that we can use the prefrontal cortex more efficiently. And then there's left to right frontal activity, which differs in people. They found in scientific studies with Buddhist monks, which they're very seasoned in meditation, they have a great degree of control of their internal emotional states, and in fact they have a greater degree of activity in the left versus right frontal lobe. And it turns out the left frontal lobe is associated with positive emotions, while the right frontal lobe, negative emotions. So they tend to be happier because they meditate regularly and they have this different frontal activity. The great news is that even if you're not a seasoned monk, you can actually change your brain, change structures in your brain in a period of 8 weeks. And you can also shift this frontal activity from the right frontal lobe to the left frontal lobe. It only takes 8 weeks, according to studies that were carried out back in 2011. And that's good news for us because it means we can actually shift our frontal lobe activity and start to change structures like the hippocampus and the amygdala by carrying out simple meditation practice. And indeed, that's the first habit practice which I'm referring to, meditation. So there's many types of meditation. We're not going to get into those sorts of details, but it's all about being able to learn to direct your focus, to concentrate more effectively, and to really um, develop your ability to attend to information. Because often when we forget information, it's not because of a memory issue, it's because of an attention issue. We haven't really paid attention. For instance, you go into a room, you forget why you were there. That's because you weren't attending to the reason why you wanted to go into the new room. It's not about your memory. So that's good news. Or you forget where your keys are. Well, it's just you haven't attended to where you placed them. It's not really a memory issue. Then there's something called block time. This has to do with mental productivity. And you can become much more effective in how much work you get done, either in your job or if you're an entrepreneur or self-employed at home or in your home office. And it's all about focused work sessions, which incorporate something called BRAC rhythms, or basic rest and activity cycles. And there's these reoccurring brain cycles, roughly 90 minutes, and they're just cycles of alert activity and slowing down activity in the brain. When you get to the end of one of these BRAC cycles, you'll find that you're a little bit maybe foggy or tired, and that's a good time to kind of take a little 5 to 10 minute break to coordinate with those naturally occurring cycles in the brain. So block time, focus sessions where you get lots of work done, but you take breaks in between. Moving on to the third pillar of a high performance brain, I call this nourish your neurons, or nourish your neurochemistry. And in quite a few neuroscience books out there that have to do with optimization, they talk about the pillars of developing a more optimal brain, and they look at nutrition and sleep and things of that nature. So a couple of important facts about the brain. As you may have heard, the brain is somewhere between 70 to 85% water in some estimates. And so regular hydration is extremely important. If you dehydrate your brain, this results in things like headaches and tiredness and foggy mental state. So you want to make sure you're hydrated. It's very important for your brain, your body, and your immune system. Now, neurons are, again, the building blocks of the brain, and they are made of fat. So you want to make sure you have sufficient high quality fat in your diet. You don't want to reduce the fat in your diet because high quality fat is actually extremely important for nourishing the membranes of your neurons. And if you're taking in things like trans fatty acids, that's actually damaging to the fatty tissue of the neurons, and they're more rigid and less efficient. Something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, it's a neurotrophin, a protein in the brain. It's called Miracle-Gro by Dr. John Ratey, and it's responsible for increasing neurogenesis, that's the creating of new neurons in the brain. It's also responsible for neuron repair. It influences our learning and memory, so really, really important protein in the brain. Then there are the glial cells. They're the so-called support centers for the neurons, which signal information in the brain. So nourishing the brain is nourishing not only the neurons, but the glial cells, which then help to detoxify the neurons and clear out all the garbage in the brain. So two important habit practices: aerobic exercise and superfoods. So aerobic exercise, according to Dr. John Ratey, is probably the most powerful habit that you can implement in your life to improve how your brain functions. So aerobic exercise we can do several times a week, 3 to 5 times a week. Really what you want to do is just raise your heart rate for 30 to 60 minutes, and this can be walking, jogging, running, cycling, treadmill, hiking, things of that nature. Just raising your heart rate, that's the important key. Then there are the so-called superfoods. Now this could be a whole full day course in itself, but just briefly, as an example, you want to take in high ORAC or high antioxidant foods like raw cacao, and goji berries and acai, many high antioxidant foods we can look at. Very colorful fruits tend to be high in antioxidants. So make sure you're taking high nutrient superfoods in your diet every day because that's really important for the brain. The antioxidants, they're important because there's something called free radicals. It's a naturally occurring process that occurs in the brain, which can be damaging to brain cells. And so we really want to counteract that by taking high antioxidant foods every day. Now, the fourth pillar is called rewire your neural networks and sensory pathways. So we talked about the neural networks in the brain, and we can impact those networks by the kind of information we're exposed to, the associations we make when we're learning new information, and also by just experiencing novel situations in life that will rewire some of the networks in the brain. For instance, learning a new instrument, you're really rewiring very specific areas of the brain because it's a very intensive learning experience to learn a new instrument. Highly recommended. Habit. Hebb was a Canadian psychologist who discovered this learning process in the brain. The basic process through which our brain learns is, quote, a mantra in neuroscience. It's called neurons that fire together, wire together. So when we're learning new information, neurons are being wired up together based on the kind of information. So a very important process in the brain that has to do with the rewiring of cell assemblies or networks of neurons. So continuing learning all throughout life, continuing your education, whatever form that is, doesn't have to be academic, is really important for boosting something known as cognitive reserve. And this idea of cognitive reserve is important because it can actually reduce the risk of age-related mental disorders like Alzheimer's disease or dementia. So as I alluded to, we want to have novel learning experiences throughout life. Mastering a challenging new subject matter or just being exposed to new things every day is really important for keeping the brain alive, of enriching those neural networks and boosting our cognitive reserve. So we mentioned aerobic exercise in the previous pillar. There's something called neurobics, which is like exercise for your brain. And that is really just exposure to new and novel situations and sensory combinations. For instance, doing things which you don't normally do, like you get dressed in the morning, say you get dressed with your eyes closed. Or if you don't normally have music playing when you're eating dinner, you put on some music while you're preparing dinner or eating dinner. And maybe you're playing your instrument. Well, you could put on some incense or essential oils. So you're creating new sensory combinations and radically novel experiences, like taking a new route to work in the morning. Or if you're used to cycling on a certain path, you change the path. Neurobics is important because what they found is that the neurons can actually nourish themselves with their own nutrients. They're called neurotrophins. So neurobics can lead to the boosting of neurotrophins in the brain. Very exciting. There's a new book that came out about neurobics a few years ago. Check that out on Google. There's not that many books on neurobics to my knowledge. Now, the fifth pillar of the brain, synchronize your rhythmic systems. We talked about different systems in the brain and body that are governed by certain rhythms or cycles. We have the so-called brain waves, beta, alpha, theta, delta, that indirectly can boost, directly can boost your brain's connectivity and indirectly influence this idea of neuroplasticity in the brain. Then we've got so-called heart-brain synchrony. Now, the heart is actually intelligent. They've discovered a little brain in the heart, and by accessing that heart intelligence, you can actually boost mental clarity and boost your brain's performance in general. So the heart is like a major biological resonator in the body, and when it's working coherently, it can actually harmonize the brain and other systems in the body, like the immune system. So very important, this idea of heart-brain synchrony. Then there's so-called circadian cycles, those daily rhythms in your body that can be influenced by various things, but one of them is sunlight exposure. So sunlight exposure I've listed here as an important habit, which influences levels of serotonin in your brain. Serotonin leads to melatonin. So in order to have more melatonin, you want to produce serotonin. So that influences not only our moods and our emotional states, but also our sleep-wake cycle. Sunlight exposure, very important. Even if it's cloudy out, you're going to get a lot more luminosity from going outside than you will get from the lighting inside buildings and offices. Musical entrainment, an important habit for influencing the brain. Just listening to music can entrain the brain into those various brainwave frequencies, beta, alpha, theta, depending on the type of music. Now, slow baroque music is known to be important for enhancing learning. By having slow baroque music on in the background, you can actually boost your vocabulary acquisition and help to speed up the learning of a new language, for example. So musical entrainment not only important for synchronizing the brain and body rhythms, but also for accelerating the learning process. And that is leading to the next pillar, which I call accelerate your learning and memory. So this has to do with various systems and mnemonics we can use to essentially accelerate how quickly we learn information and increase our memory capacity by organizing information more efficiently. And we can chunk or map information. There's memory encoding strategies or mnemonics, more efficient ways of attending and consolidating information. Then we've got review and reading techniques, such as how we review information or over-review information. There's something called SQ3R, which is an efficient reading technique. So many ways of enhancing, optimizing the learning process, of boosting your memory. And so one important habit practice that has to do with accelerated learning is multi-sensory learning. You really want to incorporate as many sensory modalities as possible when you're learning a new subject matter. Rather than just reading information, you want to speak it out loud. You want to visualize it. You want to create visual mnemonics to help consolidate the information. You want to get your hands on the information by creating little memory cards. So multi-sensory learning, really important because it enriches the networks in the brain that consolidate a new memory. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, slow baroque music is important for learning new information. Having it on in the background really sort of induces those alpha brain waves, which are good for learning many types of information and learning a new language in particular. So now we're coming towards the end of our model, our framework. We've got seventh pillar of a high performance brain, and it's called reprogram your mental and emotional patterns. Very important pillar because it's how we utilize our brain for our successes in life. So real versus imagined. What that means is the brain can actually not tell the difference between that which we see or hear and that which we imagine seeing or hearing. So for instance, if someone is imagining playing the piano, some of the same networks in the brain are activated as just as playing the piano in real time. Similarly, if we imagine something, then the occipital lobe, which governs vision, is activated. So this we can use to our advantage, this fact of real versus imagined, by creating new neural grooves in the brain. Because when we repeat certain thoughts or emotions, that creates certain grooves in the brain. They may be good for us or not so good. So we can create new positive grooves in the brain or neural grooves by activating certain positive trains of thought, by disciplining our emotional patterns so they don't get out of control. Something called neural resonance is really a concept that has to do with some really great research that Joe Dispenza has done, all about breaking the habit of being yourself, of in essence creating that new ideal persona or personality. And when we do so, we create new neural patterns. We create a new neural resonance in the brain related to that new personality. How do we do that? Well, there's a couple of habit practices we can implement in our life. The first, and I consider most important, is mental rehearsal. We know that Olympic athletes are actually able to gain a competitive advantage over others by mentally rehearsing their desired outcome. So they practice their craft, whether it's running or pole vaulting, but they also mentally rehearse in advance of the actual competition how they want to actually perform in real time. And very important mental rehearsal can be used for many, many things, not just the Olympics or, physical competitions, but you can literally mentally rehearse any uh, skill or hobby or piece of information or procedure or physical process in your imagination ahead of time. What they found as experiments where they compare someone who's learning scales on the piano versus someone who just imagines learning those scales, they're similarly engaging the brain. Another experiment where they had people imagining lifting weights with their finger, with their arm, and people actually lifting weights, there was actually changes in the physiology of the muscle for those people who merely imagined the weight exercises. So that's pretty profound research, which shows that we have incredible impact on the development of our brain simply by doing this thing called mental rehearsal and mental programming. Second habit is reframing. We really want to reframe what we perceive as negative situations because it has a debilitating impact in the brain. It creates a stress response. And research has shown that for every negative thought we experience, we need to replace it with 3 to 5 positive thoughts. Okay, so a very important piece of research there that has to do with how we engage with the stress response. And we really want to balance things out by doing this thing called reframing.